This is episode 9. Forgiveness freed me from decades of burden. I didn't realize the depth of the hurt from this incident until I acknowledged it and did something to remedy it. This is an excerpt from my book, Stand There and Look Pretty, Darling, written as a tribute to a man named Johnny. Hi, I'm Sue Rabe, and this is Living Your Authentic Life podcast for women over 50. Did you ever make an innocent mistake as a child that grew to haunt you as an adult? That's what happened to me. I grew up in a plantation-like environment. There were many people of color who worked for my family, and they were not treated equally in my eyes. There were many people who lived down on what is called the place. That was our farm. Even though I never lived on the place, lots of the people who lived and worked there came into town also and worked for our family. One of these people was a lady named B, who supposedly pushed my dad around in his baby carriage. She was born out on the place. When I was a little girl, she would come on Saturday nights and spend the night to take care of me and my siblings, because my parents went out every Saturday night. We had a bed in the long, wide hallway for B, and to this day, we call it B's bed. B had 3 grandchildren, Johnny, Elton, and Alma Jean. As I recall, Johnny left Texas after graduating from high school and moved to California. When I was about 5 years old, one Saturday night, Johnny was in town and came over to visit his grandmother at our house. We lived in the largest house in town at the time. It was built in 1901 and had an outhouse out back. The people who were employed by my family were expected to use that outhouse. Well, on this particular evening, while Johnny was visiting his grandmother, he used the restroom in our house. My job at this particular time in my life was chief tattler. I had 3 older siblings, and it was my job to keep my parents informed of all the things my siblings were doing wrong, or at least that they shouldn't be doing, in my eyes. Johnny was no exception. When he used the restroom in our house, I immediately ran upstairs and told my parents, because I knew that what he had done was not right. Now, being chief tattler, that was all I thought about, tattling. I never really thought about the consequences of my tattling. To my surprise, my dad was very upset, and he immediately went downstairs and told Johnny that he knew better and he needed to leave. Johnny very gracefully obeyed my father and left, cutting short his visit with his beloved grandmother. When I saw what had happened, I felt ashamed of myself, as my mother often told me I should be for other things that I had done. My parents finished getting dressed and left the house for the country club and dinner. B and I were left at home alone. I don't remember talking to B about what happened, how I felt. I do remember thinking how Johnny had come all this way to visit his grandmother and had been told to leave. Not only was he being punished, but B was being punished because of my behavior. I was guilty of tattling and causing this disappointment. This incident was something that would occasionally surface briefly in my awareness, only to be pushed back in the recesses of my memories. I feel like I was carrying this subconsciously as a burden for decades. A few years back, I started an organization called Women Healing the World, and one of our missions is to heal race relations. I realized that I had to start with me, and not knowing what else to do at the time, I began by writing stories, tributes to the people who helped raise me, because I really do appreciate all they did for me. They were part of molding me into who I am today. I hope that they enjoyed taking care of me. I appreciate that they were always kind to me. Then I started to write the story about B, and when I remembered this incident with Johnny, all of the guilt and shame surfaced again. I decided that I would try and find Johnny and apologize. I managed to finally get a phone number for his sister, Alma Jean. It then took me a couple of weeks to gather the courage to call her. Finally, when I did call, I was really upset because I'd finally gotten up my courage and she was not taking calls at the time. I left a message, unsure if she would ever call me back, but she did a day or so later. When I saw her name on my phone, I was so excited. I answered, and we began catching up with each other. She had moved to California, but was now living back in Texas, in Pearland. I finally asked her, "Could you give me Johnny's phone number? I want to call him and apologize for an incident that happened when I was a little girl." She said something like, "Oh, that, yes, okay. Here's his number." "So you know what I'm talking about?" I asked. "Oh, yes," she said, which made me feel even worse and concerned about his possible reaction. Alma Jean and I finished our conversation and hung up. I was excited and scared at the same time. Having Johnny's phone number filled me with all sorts of emotions: excitement, anxiety, and fear. I was thinking, what if he is angry and yells at me? Maybe I should just leave well enough alone and not stir up any trouble. Finally, I decided I would call him. This was something I needed to do for me. If not for Johnny, if not for me, for the African American community around here and my ancestors. I needed to do it to let go of my guilt and shame. I dialed his number and he answered. We chatted for a few minutes about the weather, and then I asked him if he remembered the incident when I was a little girl, when I told on him for using the restroom inside our house. He said yes, he remembered. I told him how sorry I was for that, and how sorry I was that my father made him leave, and how I had felt bad about it for years. He could not have been kinder. He said, that was the way it was at that time, and he understood why it had happened. I said, I don't understand how your race could repeatedly put up with our behavior that way. He said again, that's water under the bridge. It's just the way it was at that time. How can you always be so kind? How can your family always be so kind? I asked. He said, my mother was very religious, and she would always remind me that someday we would all know better. Well, hopefully, we all know better now, and we're treating each other better. I hope you're right. And again, I want to say how sorry I am for being so inconsiderate of your feelings, and how sorry I am that my family treated you that way. Johnny accepted my apology and my apology for my dad and my family. I had always been concerned about how my family treated people. Johnny said that my dad was good to them. He reminded me that Bee's husband, his grandfather, ran the commissary. This was the store where all the people on the farm would get their groceries on Saturday mornings. I didn't remember that his grandfather had run the commissary. What was amazing about him telling me this was that I had had a strong flashback of that commissary as a child. Several months earlier, I was at a personal growth salon with Jean Houston. She asked us to go back in time to a place in our life that was still keeping us stuck in the present. I had a vision of a little girl standing in the doorway of the commissary between my grandfather and a black man. I was standing there picking up on all the positive and negative feelings that these two men felt toward one another, all the things that were going on in the energy field, and how confusing it was for me. I wonder now if the African American man in my vision was indeed Johnny's grandfather, Will Richardson. Hopefully, someday I can find a picture of him and see if that's who was in my vision. Johnny and I talked about going out to the farm sometime when he was in town, and I asked if he would share some stories with me from growing up there. He did report that my dad was good to his family and that his grandfather would sometimes have too much to drink and would end up in jail. Oh, yes, I said. I remember the phone calls on Sunday mornings from the jail, and my father would always say, I'll be there after church and lunch to bail him out. The calls weren't always about Johnny's grandfather, though. It happened with a number of people who worked for my dad. Johnny and I laughed. He remembered being with his grandfather, who yelled at my dad, Hey, Mr. Holland, "What you white folks doing today?" And then my dad would reply, "Now, Will, how much money is it that you want to borrow?" What a conversation. Anyway, Johnny and I finally hung up the phone, but not before I asked him to please get in touch with me when he came to town. I felt so relieved. It wasn't just the normal kind of relief either. I noticed my whole body relax at a deeper level. I noticed that I could take a deeper breath. I felt this huge openness in my chest. It felt like all my cells had been watered, that they were all juicy and dancing and electrified. I had a difficult time going to sleep that night. My body felt so excited, like tomorrow would be Christmas. I felt as if a huge burden had been taken off of me. It didn't happen all at once, but I noticed a new energy, a new release, and such happiness at having such a great conversation, such an open conversation. I do hope that this is the beginning of healing many race relationships, not just those that impacted me, but that have impacted many other people. I truly felt the body-mind connection. I had stored guilt and shame in my body for 62 years. Truly amazing what joy I felt, and how glad I was that I had reached out and called Johnny to apologize. As I am writing this, I begin to cry, wondering how the people who cared for me felt about me, as they all still hold such a special place in my heart. I know that Rhodey loved me. She worked for us for the first 9 years of my life because she wrote and told me she loved me. I still have those letters. I'm pretty sure that B loved me too, as I feel certain that she came to tell me goodbye the night she died. I cry now because I never told them how much they all meant to me. I hope that I was as loving to them as I was allowed to express. And I think that I entertained them, as I was a funny kid and I like to make people laugh and smile. They brought love and joy to my life. I hope I did the same for them. Since I wrote this story, Johnny has moved back to town, and we talk at least once a month now. Pre-COVID times, we even had meals together, which we hope to resume. It's like having lunch with a brother. We share about our lives now and current events, and I ask him probing questions sometimes about how life was like back then. It's a healing relationship for me. I think he appreciates the fact that I reached out and that I am interested in him and his family. In essence, we're developing a lovely friendship. Is there someone you need to forgive? Is there someone who needs to forgive you? I hope this story was insightful for you. Add your ideas and your experiences to the comments or send me an email. As I said, this is an excerpt from my book of stories entitled Stand There and Look Pretty, Darling. Right now, you can get a free download of my first chapter by going to Mary Sue Rabe, spelled R-A-B as in boy E.com, and go to the free tab. That's my webpage. Give it a look. Also, please subscribe to this podcast and leave a review if you like it.